Hello, Pete here from MyJerbench.com. Today we're going to be working on this Jules Jergensen vintage watch. This watch is not running for some reason. It's got some issues. I don't know why. It's not particularly dirty, but it hasn't been serviced in about 20 years. So we're going to get in there, do a full service, find out why it's not running right. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. If you want to get notified every time I put up a new video, hit that notification bell when you have an opportunity. So let's get started with this. We're going to first pull off the winding weight and get that off the movement. This again is an out of movement. I believe this watch is from the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to go look up the date. We'll grab that screw, put it aside in our parts tray. We'll grab the weight and put that aside. And now we're going to start looking at this particular movement. I haven't done one of these in a long time, so I'm just trying to figure out why or where the screws are for this. And there's two screws holding in the frame for the weight or the auto winding system. One screw is missing, but we'll replace that before we're done with the watch repair. Okay, so let's get the two screws out, and then we can pull off that upper frame or upper plate for the winding system. I'm not going to cut through this too much because I really want to show you how this is done with this particular model of watch. Most newer ETA movements, they have a separate or a complete separate bridge system for the winding system. However, this bridge does hold part of the train gears in position. So you can see when I take the winding system out, it exposes an unseated train. I also loosened up the balance screw, so we're going to take that out. That's the balance cock screw. We're going to remove that, put it in the parts tray, and then gently remove the balance cock and the balance wheel from the watch. I apologize for the out of focus. I tried something later on during assembly, so it'll get a little bit better. So here's the movement. It's an out of movement. Looks like a 29 to 38 or 2983. I can't tell, but it's an old out of movement. Parts for this are still readily available. Not every part, but most of them. So here you can see I started to remove the pallet fork, and then I noticed something in the watch that was not that obvious, but when I started looking at it, I started looking at the second-hand wheel or the center wheel, and I noticed there was this long piece of fuzz stuck in the wheel. That's probably why the watch didn't work. Not sure how that got in there. I'm moving on to the winding wheel for the mainspring. I'm going to pull the screw off. That is a standard threaded screw. We'll grab that gear, put that in the parts tray. And I'll start removing the train. So we'll grab the center pinion or center wheel. We'll grab the other gears and get them put aside in our parts tray and ready for cleaning. And I'll start removing the pallet bridge. Just one screw holds this in place. I apologize for the focus. Keep getting my thumb in every video. Lift up the bridge, put that in the parts tray, and I'll grab the pallet fork, put that in the parts tray. Now's a good time to release the dial. So there's two little clamps that release the dial. Pull that off, and we'll move on to the winding or ratchet wheel. That is a reverse thread. Now we can pull off the bridge that holds the mainspring barrel. There's three screws that hold that bridge in place. I'll grab that last screw out. Now the click that holds the click that keeps the mainspring wound is on that bridge. It's not held down with anything, so it is loose. You have to be careful with it when you pull these bridges out. I'll grab the fourth wheel here and the barrel. We're going to change the mainspring. We'll lift up the day wheel. We'll take out the day ring and the hour wheel. Now I've left the cannon pinion exposed there. It's time to get the date ring off. To do that, there is one screw that holds down a small little bridge. That bridge covers, it holds the set wheel or the set gear, as well as a click and a spring that actuate the date ring. So we're going to pull out this tiny little bridge. Be careful with that little setting gear. And there is an exposed spring and a click. Now we can remove the date ring. And get to all these little parts, just test them and make sure that they're clean and ready to work. So I've cleaned everything, torn it apart. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with that, but I've put a new mainspring in this watch. It's time to get it oiled. We'll grab the center pinion for the mainspring barrel and get that in place. Now this will only go in one way. It is keyed. And now it's time to put the cap on the barrel. The barrel's all ready. We're going to put that aside and start assembling the watch. So the first thing I want to work on is I want to get this. This is the ratchet gear for the date ring. And that actually articulates the date ring or pushes it forward. And then we have this little bridge here with the screw. The screw goes onto that bridge. There's a little groove in between both sides of the gear, right about in the middle of it, and it sits in that bridge rather delicately. And again, you have to worry about that little spring and the date ring click. So I'm going to test fit it, make sure that it seats correctly. And I just do that with out of movements because every once in a while a spring will get loose during cleaning, or if I'm putting it back in, if I don't put it back in right, I want to make sure everything works correctly. So before I actually put the date ring in, we're just going to test it all. Once that's done, I'll take that little bridge out with the set gear, and we can then start working on inserting the date ring. Grab that screw, we'll put it aside. Grab the little bridge, move it in. It's going to go right back into place, so I'm not too worried about it. This is the armature for the day ring that I just moved in. So I'm going to seat the date ring. Make sure that that little spring is seated correctly and out of the way, and then the date ring spring under this little bridge needs to be tucked into those teeth. And then again, we can put this bridge back into place. It's a little tricky because the gear goes onto a little post on the frame of the watch. And you want to make sure you get that seated correctly before you tighten the screw down. So I'm just taking my time here, just making sure that it's on there correctly. This is dual purpose. It holds the set gear as well as holds down the date ring. Remember, the day ring itself floats on top of the surface of the movement frame. And now that it's seated correctly, we can put the screw back in that bridge and then tighten it all down. And as I'm tightening it down, I'm also making sure that it's seated correctly. There's actually the post that holds the set wheel, along with a setting or a seating post that holds that bridge in one position. And that's the reason we need the screw to hold that in place. And now I'm just turning the date ring just to make sure that the spring and the click actuate the date ring correctly. Once that's done, we can tighten down the screw, make sure that bridge is in place. And now I'm going to turn the gear that actually moves the date ring and advances it, and I'm just going to make sure that it's actually moving the date ring freely and that there's no binding to the date ring, because with any binding it'll stop the watch. So we want to make sure that it just moves freely. So very carefully you're just going to turn this, and you should see the date ring turn by itself as soon as that wheel contacts it. Just like so. Okay, now that I've got that done, we can move on to the next step. Now I've inserted the clutch and winding gear onto the stem and put the stem back in the watch. That way we can actually test things while we're working on them. And now we're off to the rewarding part. So we'll put that gear in there, the fourth gear. We'll put the barrel in place. Next thing we have to do is put the balance hack on. The balance hack is the part that actually stops the watch from working when you pull it out to the second click position. That goes in before we put the barrel bridge on. So the hack's in place. It's going to seat that properly on its little post. Once that's done, we can start inserting the bridge. And here's the bridge all assembled. I've got the click back in place, or the ratchet lock. And this will hold down the hack on the movement, and the hack is articulated with the clutch system itself. So we'll put the first screw in and tighten that down. And we'll move on to the second screw. We'll tighten that one down. And this is the correct order to reassemble the watch. And lastly, the third screw. And tighten that one down. All the while we're doing this, I'm actually oiling each of the jewels or oil points as I'm assembling this particular watch, since some of them are harder to get to. So now here's the winding gear. This is where it articulates with the ratchet, unlike some watches that work with the ratchet wheel on the barrel. This is the reverse thread screw that holds that ratchet wheel in place. And don't forget, it is reverse thread. It's always a good idea to unset it or unwind it to make sure it's seated correctly. And then once that's done, you can go ahead and tighten it down. Okay, now for the escape wheel. Get the third wheel in. And that first wheel. Take note of the way the watch comes apart when you're putting it together. You want to make sure that all the gears are seated correctly and in the right orientation. Now I'm going to get that winding gear on the mainspring pinion. That is keyed, and it uses a standard thread screw, so we'll get that screw in there, tighten it up. .900 series atom movements are really nice. You just have to remember that there is no bridge holding the train in place. You have to use the winding system to do that. So when I'm putting that on, I'm actually going to take this over to the microscope and make sure that the gears are all seated correctly in their jewels and pinions, because I don't want to do any damage to them. So that is one of the hard parts to putting this series of watch back together, because you don't want to do any damage. Once you've got those seated, then it's time to put the 3 screws back in the winding system bridge. Now that bridge does come apart into 2 pieces, an upper and a lower section. I probably could have taken it apart, but I would have dealt with all the winding gears, and I opted not to do that since the watch wasn't relatively dirty. So cleaning it and then drying it with watch rinse and dryer was perfect enough to get this watch running good. Moving on to the pallet fork, we're going to get that in position. Remember, pallet forks are very, very delicate pieces. This is one of the most delicate pieces in a watch, so you want to be very careful with that. Those jewels can hit the escape wheel and crack or chip or even come off if you're not careful. The pallet bridge goes in, it's keyed with 2 posts. You put that in, and again, I'm going to take this over to the microscope. I'm just going to make sure that everything's seated correctly, and we'll get the screw inside that bridge and tighten it down. I'm going to dab it with a little oil as I'm moving along. Once I've done that, I'm going to give it a little wind and then give the pallet a little test to make sure that the escape wheel is functioning perfectly with the pallet fork. That should click back and forth with a little bit of pressure. Now this piece here on the 2900 series, I probably could have put the balance wheel in before I put the upper system in, but it would have been much more difficult to get the train gear seated. So you got to be careful with this because the hairspring collet is actually the pin that holds the hairspring in place is actually seated underneath the bridge. So you're going to have to be very delicate and very careful with this. Again, the balance staff is very delicate and you could break it if you're not very careful. I'm going to give that a little bit of a start, and I'm going to gently push down on the balance cock, and you can see that balance wheel is running perfectly. And I'll put the screw onto the balance cock to seat it correctly and hold it in place. So here's our working watch. This is a good time for me to take it over to the timing machine and give this a test, make any adjustments I have to make before I put it in the case and finish it up. Once I've done that, it's time to assemble the upper side of the watch. First, we're going to insert the hour wheel. The hour wheel goes onto the cannon pinion under the setting gear, or onto the setting gears. Then we'll put the date ring in the day ring in place. This is keyed. This little ring is keyed to fit in one position onto the frame of the watch, and the day wheel will actually use that as its center point. So if you look closely, there's a couple little notches and a couple little pins that you have to line up correctly. Once it's seated, it'll fall into place. And then that's the arm that actuates the day ring. So that's inserted, and now we can move on to the next step. Next step is to grab the day ring, and we're going to fit that onto the watch. Now here I'm just going to turn this I'm going to turn this clockwise, and then we should feel that little click seat itself onto the gears or the teeth of the day wheel. Now we'll put the dial washer in place, and we'll seat the dial. This particular watch has two separate spacers that actually clamp into and snap onto the frame of the watch. One of them fell off. It's very common to do that. And I just had to get this back into position. Once it's snapped into position, we can put the dial back onto the watch. So you may have one of those watches that deals with this. So you're just going to have to play around with that to get it seated. Okay, so that's done. Now we can move on to setting up the dial. The dial is only going to go in one position. The date and the day are at the 6 o'clock position. Now we can align our dial feet into those holes. I didn't get a good shot of that, but here you can see the little clips that hold or put pressure onto those two dial feet and hold the dial onto the movement. And that's very common for ATA movements today. Even the quartz movements have these. So not much has changed in this particular manner, and they do work well. There's kind of like a sharpened blade at one end, the end that I'm pushing, and that pushes against the dial foot and locks it in place. With that done, now I can go ahead and test the movement, make sure that the day and the date turn so that we can easily set the watch. Once I'm happy there and everything's snapping into place, now we'll move this to the midnight position and allow the watch to set the time automatically. And once it snaps over to Thursday the 16th, we know we've reached the midnight position. So you're just going to keep turning that until you hit that marker, and there we go. Now we know we're at the midnight position. It's time to put the hands on. Of course, you start with the lowest hand. In this case, it would be the hour hand. And you're going to line that up very carefully onto the hour wheel. Aim that at the 12 o'clock position and gently push down with your watch hand pusher. Now we'll move on to the minute hand that gets attached to the cannon pinion, and you're going to put that in place as to where it should go. Again, use your hand tool to push that down. Make sure that the hand is seated correctly and that the hands have enough space in between, aren't rubbing, so that the movement won't stop if the hands touch each other. And last but not least, we'll put the second hand on the watch. Gently push that down. and it should be running fine. Now typically what I'll do is I'll run this back to the watch timer and I will check again to make sure that everything is running good. And here I'm just going to use a little bit of Rotico, and I'm going to try to remove any loose debris that's on the indicators as well as the dial. I don't do dial repair, a little bit of light cleaning, but I don't do much in dial repair. And now we'll seat the watch into the case. This customer did not want me to clean the case, so we did not clean the case. But I will replace the gaskets on the watch. Once we get that in, it's time to put the stem and crown on. We'll use the clutch release there and just push that in a little bit, snap the stem into the watch. We're good. Now we'll put the flywheel on. That has a screw that holds it in place. And you're going to put that on tightly, but not too tight. And who doesn't love the logo that Jules Jergensen uses on their watches? Now I'm just testing the winding system, and I'm making sure that everything works good. And what we're going to do is look for that gear that's spinning. I'm going to point to it right here. That should be winding in. Whenever the flywheel moves in either direction, it should be winding the mainspring, which it is. I forgot to show you putting the case clamps in, but I did put the case clamps in. I put a new gasket on this and used a little bit of Rotico to clean out the groove. Now I'm going to tighten down the case. And we're going to leave it up to the customer to pick a watch band that they'd like for this watch. I think this watch might be a family heirloom, or it might have been passed down through the family. I'm not sure. And now it's time to set. You can see how nice that movement works. ETA movements are really nice movements. I have always liked them. And we're going to set it at about 2:24. Now I'll set the date and the day. And there you have it. This beautiful Jules Jergensen watch that is running very good. I got this adjusted to about 1 second per day, which isn't too bad for a watch of this era. Guys, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And if you want more information on this watch, like the history of Jules Jergensen, check out the link below to go to my website and check it out. Thanks for watching, guys, and have a great day.